FDR came into office in 1933 to deal with the domestic crisis left behind by Republican, progressive Herbert Hoover. Hoover was the George W. Bush of the era. FDR was the candidate of change. He was their Barack Obama. Happy days are here again. That was the slogan. It was the same idea as hope and change. Except this president actually came through with the second part of his promise. FDR was going to bring in a new era of prosperity for America. He was going to unite the country. He was going to end poverty. And his New Deal for America was going to usher in a recovery for the nation and restart the engine of America. That was his promise. But he was not elected to deal with a world at war. The United States was taken off guard when it happened. Unemployment was still, years after FDR's election, at 25%. Production was down by a third. One half of the nation's wealth was wiped out, gone. And because of Woodrow Wilson's policies, the United States was deeply entangled in foreign affairs, the kind that our founders warned us against. And Democrats, strangely, have always been in favor of global intervention. But they're progressives, progressive Democrats and progressive Republicans. When it comes to military, they think that militaries are unnecessary and evil. So Roosevelt goes on and criminalizes companies like DuPont and General Electric, General Motors, Colt Arms, and Boeing. He calls them merchants of death. He blames the war overseas on them and not the progressives for putting the United States into the war in the first place. Companies like DuPont had been supplying America's armed forces with gunpowder since the American Revolution. And FDR comes in and guts their budget to 2% of the national budget. Our national defense is dead. Under FDR, our military shrank. It shrinks to 18th, the 18th largest military in the world. That was just ahead of Holland. And on the eve of war in Europe, FDR tests our army to see what they're made of. Well, he found out they looked like a bunch of girls with BB guns. They actually ran around with broomsticks with no direction, frequently bumping into each other and getting lost. So when the White House learns that Hitler has just invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, Roosevelt literally said, quote, "God help us all." Things get much, much worse then in Europe. And finally, Roosevelt realizes we have to do something. It's time to act. And the defense spending tops $1 billion for the first time since 1918. But this was nothing in comparison to his domestic spending. During his first 100 days alone, FDR spent $3.3 billion on one stimulus bill. Any of this sounding familiar? Unions form for the very first time under him, and czars are appointed for the first time in history. They only answer to FDR. His main goal, spread the wealth. He says people are looking to us for guidance and an equitable opportunity to share the distribution of national wealth. This is more than a political campaign. It's a call to arms. FDR creates the 40-hour work week. We have just recently reduced it further to 30 hours. Minimum wage, workers' compensation, unemployment benefits, the National Recovery Administration, which John Garrity, the man who wrote it, admits is based on the economic experiments of Nazi German and fascist Italy without establishing totalitarian dictatorship. He creates Social Security. He creates Medicare and Medicaid. He suspends the gold standard through executive order. He mandates everyone with gold exchange it for the fixed price of the U.S. dollar. He then imposes new taxes. He jacks up everyone's existing taxes. And finally creates the Security and Exchange Commission, which regulates Wall Street and everything else. Joseph Kennedy is now in charge. Meanwhile, his Treasury Secretary is furious. He's worried because the U.S. is reaching its debt limit. So he begs Roosevelt, stop the spending or we're in real trouble. People are losing their money. For every single dollar they deposit, they get back 85 cents. The government spending increases from 8% to gross national product 10%. He tries to end the cutthroat competition by forcing industries to follow brand new regulations for their own good. He imposes price restrictions and restrictions on production. And because of these measures, the economy sees a short rebound, just in time for him to get reelected in 1936. But in 1937, right after his reelection, the economy tanks again because his solutions weren't real. Everyone told him, hey, you need to stop spending. He ignored them. He launched a $5 billion spending initiative he believed would improve the economy. His budget director gets fed up and leaves because, just like Obama is doing, he believed he was doing nothing but running constant deficits to fund all of these programs. Even the Supreme Court begins opposing and overturning his overhaul. And in reaction to this, the president actually had the audacity to suggest that he would just appoint 6 new justices, saying the Supreme Court should have new blood if they weren't going to agree with him. Abroad, FDR was initially neutral, but in 1940 his rhetoric changed, and changed on a dime. No longer was he talking about neutrality. Instead, America should be, quote, the arsenal of democracy. And we went ahead and helped the British troops in Iceland first. Hitler and Mussolini grew infuriated, and they responded by joining together. Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and imperialist Japan. An enemy became our enemy under Woodrow Wilson. FDR starts to give direct massive military and economic aid to Britain, China, and the Soviet Union. And because the enemy had grown so ugly, the public supported the war because they were horrified. In 1940, FDR is elected for a 3rd time. No one had ever run for a 3rd term before. They followed the adage of George Washington: 2 terms is enough. But he uses the Chicago machine, and he gets elected. He moves the Democratic Convention to Chicago, where he had strong support from the city machine, which controlled the auditorium loudspeaker, while claiming he wouldn't run unless nominated by the people. He uses the Chicago loudspeaker to broadcast a public cry of, "We want Roosevelt! The world wants Roosevelt!" And consequently, he was nominated, and the Democratic National Committee put his name on the ballot. Wendell Willkie, the GOP opponent, crusades against this. He begins to accuse him of being a war hawk and crusades against his failure to end the Depression. Willkie was their Rand Paul or their Ted Cruz. He really wasn't about parties. He was about limited government and economic prosperity. Unfortunately, today, Willkie is a dark horse, and no one even knows who he is. Let's hope that doesn't repeat itself in the years to come. In the 1940 election, Roosevelt still stresses his intention to keep the U.S. out of war. "You boys are not going to be sent into any foreign war," he says. He wins with 55% of the popular vote in 38 states. The claims about not sending anybody to war are as empty as they were when Woodrow Wilson sent them to be reelected right before World War I. His 3rd term, it was dominated by World War II. The defeat of Nazi Germany became a priority for both the U.S. and Britain to ensure world safety. Most support the war, but FDR still had some critics. Those critics call FDR an irresponsible warmonger. So he initiates FBI and IRS investigations against his loudest critics. Does this sound familiar? Also, war with Japan is boiling. The world is in trouble. Then something unexpected happens. During a summit, an Army Chief of Staff General, George Marshall, a soft-spoken man who had dedicated his life to the Army, stands up and asks the president, "Sir, may I have 3 minutes?" Roosevelt nods. Yes. George Marshall, certainly not known for his eloquence, goes in and delivers the speech of his life. He says France is collapsing, Britain will be next, and the United States could end up facing Nazi Germany alone on our own shores. And because what we have done, America doesn't have the money or the ability to even make the planes. We don't have enough planes. We don't have enough soldiers. We don't have enough guns, not enough tanks or artillery or machine guns to fight a war with Germany. If 5 German divisions land anywhere on the coast, Marshall tells the president, they'll go anywhere they want. If, meanwhile, trouble heats up in the Pacific over Japan's ambitions there, the situation will be even more hopeless. Marshall told the president point blank, "It's time to get serious about arming America for the war. If you don't do something, and do it right now, I don't know what's going to happen to our country." The answer FDR found was American industry and the American ingenuity, the American engine, literally the American engine. Bill Knudsen of General Motors, he was chosen to coordinate it. Knudsen would play a critical role in saving virtually everything there was to save. Big Bill, as they called him, believed that hard work was the best way to spend time. And with that attitude, he rose to prominence in Ford Motors, assisting Henry Ford himself with the assembly line. It's actually Knudsen who creates it. Oh, and after GM snatched him up and put him in charge of the Chevy division, the Chevy was on the verge of extinction, and Big Bill helped it regain financial stability and became the best-selling car in the country. And he would become the head of GM. But he was the man to save the country. His family actually told him, "Bill, how can you do this? FDR has demonized you. You can't go to work for that guy. He doesn't stand for anything you stand for." He took a plane and went to the Oval Office and met with FDR. He said, I'm here to serve the country. And I'm here to serve for $1 a year. Well, it was under Big Bill's guidance the American industry reached a production capability that surprised even the president and every American. It was the American assembly line and the decentralization of our system that did it. On December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and the U.S. focus shifted to the Pacific Theater. Meanwhile, under Big Bill, we had perfected the B-24 bomber and other war machines and all of their glitches, and it played a vital role in defeating our threats in the Atlantic. It also spurred on economic growth and brought employment down to 1 million people. Ultimately, we outproduced the Axis power in numbers that were previously thought impossible, and we surpassed them in quality, the Germans. This was only possible at the very last hour because government got out of private life and industry and deferred to the individual. In 1944, we won the war and our economy was back on track because of the creativity, the hard work, and knowledge that comes with private enterprise. Our victory in World War II shows that even in the darkest of times, miracles in this country are still possible. But many times it is the people of this country that is the miracle, and certainly not the government. That year, we ignited the beacon of freedom around the world, not because we went into every country and demanded it of them, but because we had led by example. With our power and our might, we used our freedom to rescue the world and free it, liberate it from the old menacing threat of tyranny. I would ask that you would tell your story, this story, our story, to your children, so they know what really happened. They know that our freedom was truly threatened, not just externally by the Nazis, but internally by our own government. Our own government threatened our liberty and our economy. Make sure they know how and why we, the United States of America, ultimately prevailed in the end.